Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is part 7 of a series focused on endpoint protection in Configuration Manager, which of course is part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Today's session will focus on Windows Defender application control policies in Configuration Manager and how you can use them to manage Windows Defender application control in your environment. So but before we jump in, just quick discussion. Why are we talking about this topic, right? Well, so what? Just in the spirit of trying to learn about and understand all of the things that are available to you for management through Configuration Manager, we'll talk about Intune in the same vein uh, in another series. Also, these capabilities are built in, right? You have them as part of Configuration Manager. You have them as part of Windows 10. You may even already own these uh, capabilities, be licensed for these capabilities. If you have E5, for example, then that's the case. And also the ability that you can give these tools to your security professionals and allow them to work with the settings and so on in the Configuration Manager console, really tailoring their experience to what they need using role-based access controls and so on, right? As all of the sessions in this series, the focus is Configuration Manager. But in order to even have the discussion, it is needed to be able to at least understand what the feature is that we're trying to administer. So we will spend some time talking about the concept of what Windows Defender Application Control actually is, right? Okay, so let's jump in. Here is the agenda that we're going to run with. Start off with a discussion of what is Windows Defender Application Control, and then move into the other stuff. What is it? Look at the requirements, talk about some of the considerations for it, and then on we go, right? Okay, so what is Windows Defender Application Control? Well, it's a feature that is part of Windows 10. It is also part of Server 2016 forward. I should say Windows 10 1703, I believe, forward, but really we're well beyond 1703 as I do this video recording. It's something that is referred to in the documents. You'll see it even on the system in a minute, called configurable code integrity, right? And so configurable code integrity, uh, and again, another name for this application control thing, is basically describing this feature, which is a security component that's enforced basically in the Windows kernel itself, right? It's going to take effect early enough in the boot process before almost any other of the OS components that are loaded, well before traditional antivirus software, right? With this feature, you're going to be able to set policy to not only control the code that's running in user mode of your devices, but also in kernel mode, some of the hardware and software drivers that might run as part of Windows. You can control and determine which are allowed and so on. So configurable code policy can then be protected even from a local admin. So if you have users that are local admin on the machine and there would be any concern that they could get in and tamper with the settings and so on, you can prevent that by digitally signing the policy. So even a local admin can't interfere, so to speak, with policy being deployed. This is a feature that works really well alongside the hypervisor protected portions of code integrity. So again, code integrity is kind of an umbrella term of which Windows Defender Application Control is a part. We, in the previous session, talked about Windows Defender Application Guard. That requires the hypervisor component. There is no hypervisor component. There's no specific hardware or software requirements at all for application control. The only requirement is that the operating system support it, right? Windows 10, 1703 or better, or Server 2016 forward. Okay, so the real focus is to try to help mitigate attacks, whether those attacks are intentional or unintentional, right? Um, In most organizations, you have information as the most valuable asset. And so making sure that only approved users have access to that information is absolutely, critical. And protecting files and making sure that you have any sensitive information protected. You can control what applications run in your environment, how those applications interact with data, and so on, is a really big deal. With application control, to, you're able to whitelist applications that you want to run in your environment and then prevent others from running in your environment. There's the concept of trust. So IT admins who trust applications can certainly, again, whitelist those. There is also the concept of an application earning trust, right? And so Microsoft has a service called the Intelligent Security Graph. And with the Intelligent Security Graph, uh, we will evaluate applications and effectively allow them to earn trust and effectively earn a known good reputation. And when that happens, then you can accept those applications also as ones that can run on your devices in your environment. That's an optional config. Basically, the way you do it is you opt in to allowing applications that are approved by the Microsoft Intelligence Security Graph to run on your devices, and then it just saves some work on the part of IT admins to check every single application and so on. Again, all of that's documented more so for you to look at, read, understand, right? And then there's a number of organizations who have endorsed application control as a really critical part of security. One is the Australian Signals Directorate, really, really stood behind application control and underscores the value of having a tool like application control to help shape and protect your environment, right? Okay. So what are Windows Defender application control policies? Well, these policies, now we're talking about config manager, right? But in the general generic sense, these policies are basically configurations that you want to apply to your devices. You build the policy using whatever means you want to use. Configuration manager, again, in this discussion, and there are other tools, and then you will want to apply those configurations using a mechanism uh, that would be appropriate for your environment. Again, config manager is the topic of this discussion, but it might be something else too. Uh, these policies will then need to be implemented on your device, and so they will need to make their way down to the device and be in the appropriate location so that the device will see them and try to use them whenever it turns on, right? So again, config manager is the focus here, but we will mention a couple of other ways to do that as well. So why do we care, right? Well, these are built in, and so why wouldn't you at least want to know what's built in and available to you? Um, these policies allow you the enterprise-wide control that you need, and also with the config manager piece to manage these policies, we have consistency, we have predictability. We can reduce the complexity of these policies. So whenever you see the policies here in a minute, you'll understand that these can be complex to understand and to build and so on. And really some tools to help shortcut that complexity are out there, config manager being one of them. But where we can reduce complexity yet enable these capabilities for you to use in your organization, it's just a good thing, right? So, and config manager combined with WDAC allows for that to be the case. So what are the requirements for this? Right. Well, I mentioned you need Windows 10 17.0. I said 17.03. It's 17.09 or better. And there's advantages if you're on Windows 10 19.03 or better. But if you're on 17.09 or better, it is supported, but it just gets a little bit more capability, a little bit easier, some more flexibility if you're on 19.03 or better. Windows Server 2016 or better, you can also used with Windows Defender Application Control. And then you need policies that are configured and deployable to the environment. And so there's, again, multiple ways to configure Windows Defender Application Control. One of them is through group policy, right? There's also Endpoint Manager, which we're talking about here, which could be Configuration Manager or Intune. You can configure things with PowerShell. There's also a tool that I will mention near the end of the discussion. That's an external tool you can use to configure policy. Whichever mechanism you use, we need to get those policies configured in order for Windows Defender Application Control to be able to know what to do and to have rules that it will act upon. Okay, and so some considerations as we're working our way to the demo. As you think about deploying Windows Defender Application Control, it's really like anything that you might want to deploy. It's going to have a life cycle, right? And so managing that life cycle, understanding that life cycle, and I'm not going to dig into each one of these, right? These are documented about what these are in application control, and probably you can infer what they are in and of themselves, right? But these are important, right? So managing the life cycle of the source control. These are policies that will impact your environment and are set in a certain way that IT deems necessary for securing your environment. So controlling the source of those policies so that you always have the originals and can go back to the originals, update the originals and so on as you manage devices in your environment is huge. Policy rule upgrades. So as, again, you move through the life cycle of management and you update your policies and so on, a big deal. Managing events in your environment. And so what does that mean? Application control will write its detail into event logs so that you can see what's actually going on and anything that's been blocked and different things, right? And so managing those processes and seeing what's happening and being able to scavenge those event logs, maybe even pull them into one location that you can review collectively is a big deal. So having that mechanism is good. Knowing what the implications of application control are, such as help desk. How's the help desk going to be impacted by application control? Are they equipped to be able to respond appropriately to phone calls around application control events? What about end users? How's that going to play out? What's the application control policy going to do to application and end user support situations, right? And then finally, document. You want to make sure that your decisions, the way that you've implemented things, are fully and completely documented for anyone who needs to come behind you and see what's going on, right? A few scenarios with application control, right? So in a typical deployment of application control, it's going to take place in phases, right? You're not going to just turn on application control. It's going to go through a process of maybe auditing and then finally enforcement after you get comfortable with what's happening. There are some specific scenarios that we think about whenever we think about application control. The first might be lightly managed. This would be a company-owned device, but the users are free to install software. The devices themselves are required to run the organization's antivirus solution and client management tools. Here, application control can be used to help protect the kernel and also monitor, known as auditing in application control, for program applications rather than actually locking them down. So we're going to see what's going on, but we're not going to enforce action on the device. And then contrast that with fully managed, where IT defines the specific list of software that can be run. Users can request software on their device from a list of applications IT provides. We'll talk about more of that in a minute through something like Configuration Manager. You can configure Config Manager to be what's called a managed installer so that anything that Config Manager deploys to the device will be automatically trusted. So that might be an avenue to achieve that one. Basically, you're going to take an initial baseline of the machine and set that baseline into WDAC policy, apply that, and then make changes to it as needed on a per system basis. Again, not a detailed discussion of this, just some scenarios that we have that you can find some documentation on or work through yourself. There's the fixed workload scenario where devices are going to do the same thing day after day after day. And so those can be locked down and maintained probably a little bit more easily and straightforward with application control policies because they do the same thing time and again. Then we have BYOD. So this likely is not the best scenario for application control. You might do auditing here, but this is not your device. And so if you have BYOD, that may be a better fit, probably is, for something like conditional access as a control mechanism for managing those systems, right? Okay. And just as we're about to step into the demonstration of this, some concepts that we need to understand. So this is, again, we're focusing on Config Manager and application control. If you configure application control with Config Manager, these are the kinds of things that you need to understand and consider and know that are going to be potentially configured. And so there's really three options that you have, three configurations, I guess, the choices maybe that you have whenever you're configuring application control through Configuration Manager. I struggled with the term choices or options or whatever because the first one is really not a choice. Whenever you deploy an application control policy with Configuration Manager, that application control policy is going to be built in such a way that it configures Configuration Manager as what's called a managed installer. So a managed installer is basically you configuring something like Config Manager, something like Intune, something like maybe a third-party solution that installs things in your environment as an approved and trusted entity. And so anything that's installed through that pathway will automatically be trusted by Windows Defender Application Control and allowed to run. So in Config Manager, whenever we build any policy at all, Config Manager is included as a managed installer, right? Now, we're not going to include in Config Manager policy anything else as a managed installer, but certainly Config Manager will be included as a managed installer, which means even after you lock down the system with application control, if you decide to install an application with Configuration Manager, that application is automatically trusted, right? Now, so optionally, you can also do what I'm referring to as manual whitelisting. So that means that you have, as you're configuring the system, you have certain paths or files and so on that you know that you want to trust and approve to run in the environment. And so you can configure that when you're building the policy. And so when the policy goes out to the system, it will, the system will be scanned and anything in those paths will be configured as trusted. Now here's something really, really important to understand. This is a one-time thing only. So when you deploy the policy, and let's just say, for example, program files is in the path as trusted, then Config Manager will scan everything in program files and create a trust list for things that it finds there. And so anything in program files at the time the policy is applied will run and be trusted and no issue. But if you subsequently then go install another application to the program files directory, it will not run, it will not be trusted because, again, that scan of the program files directory and the policy created as a result of that will not have been done until before that new application was installed. So you would need to cause that pathway to be rescanned or find another mechanism that can add that new application to the trusted path, right? And then finally, Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph. Optionally, you can choose to include that so that applications that earn trust with Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph, you can accept those and run them just by default. Again, that's optional. For this policy, you're going to target it to devices, and that's going to be your only choice, but this will be device centric. Whenever you target it to a collection, will need to be devices, Windows 10 or Server 2016 or better. And then also at the bottom, when you deploy a config manager policy or an application control policy created by config manager, there will be certain things that config manager whitelists by default for being allowed to run on the device. And you see some of those. So operating system components, hardware dev center drivers, Windows Store apps, config manager deployed software, updates to Windows components driven by the pieces listed below, right? So those will be by default included as well. Okay, so let's move on to the fun stuff, getting this set up and seeing how it works. And to do that, let me pull in my config manager server. So I've mentioned that you can actually go configure this a couple of different ways with PowerShell, group policy, different things, right? Yes, you can. I really thought about trying to include a discussion of doing that in this session, and I finally ended up in a place of, nah, I'm not really going to spend the time on that. They are options that you can pursue. There's better ways to maybe, or better ways to do it these days versus, something like GPO or PowerShell. And so I'm going to show you config manager. I'm going to mention another piece as well and quickly show it to you, not in any detail at all, and try to pull a couple of things together. But let's just start with config manager. And when we get to config manager, it's really pretty easy to configure a policy. So the challenge is not in using config manager to build the policy. It's really straightforward. It's more in the planning for it, in the deciding what to do phase of this, right, before you deploy policies out at all. And a couple of notes. With Windows 10 1703 or better, then Windows is always going to be flagged for an automatic restart if it's needed when you deploy an application control policy, right? With Windows 10 1709 or better, that restart is going to automatically be enforced, right? Now, config manager will set those requirements and so on according to what's defined under the restart settings for client settings and so on, but those are the difference, right? So how do we go about configuring this? Well, you see I've already got a policy configured. So I'm under assets and compliance, I'm under endpoint protection, and I'm under application control. So this is really pretty easy. I have a policy. I can just right click and go create a new one, no issue. But I've already got one configured and deployed to my collection with my Windows 10 device. So I'm just going to open this up. And so you're going to see really pretty straightforward. Name, and then basically enforce a restart of devices that need it, right? And so, as I mentioned, Windows 10 1709 or better, it's just going to happen, right? But this is here just to allow you for maybe previous OSs where you might want that control. Then you have enforcement mode or audit mode. So this is completely up to you which one you want. Generally, you will start with audit mode. I'm in enforcement mode just because it's my lab and I can do what I would like. And then the only other options you have here are installation, or implementation. Here I've said, yes, go ahead and trust the Microsoft Security Graph. And then I've provided a few paths that I want to scan and trust whenever I deploy this policy. Now, again, this is me in my lab being very simple. You can do whatever you like. Only thing I'll remind you of is that whenever you configure paths here, it's going to scan that path whenever the policy is processed on the machine, but it's not going to do that continually, right? It's a one-time thing. And it doesn't have to be just a path either. It can be files as well, right? So that's an option. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, very straightforward to configure this and then deploy it. So I do have this deployed. Let's go to my Windows 10 machine and actually see it working. So here is my Windows 10 machine. Get signed in, and I don't know exactly why, unless the experience is different than when I was setting this up. I won't be able to actually get into the configuration manager applet. I'm not sure why it's locked down right now or why it's not behaving, but it's not. It wasn't, and I still don't think it is acting right, and so I may not be able to launch it. Let's just see what happens. So config manager, and no, I'm clicking on it. It's not coming up. I'm not sure why. It's definitely working. So if I could launch that, I would show you that the policy is actually coming down as or on the configuration tab. So basically using compliance settings, coming down to the configuration tab, and you would have seen that it's compliant as it worked through the system and so on. Can't show you that, but trust me, it is there. It is functional. It is compliant. And so what I've done is, as you've seen, I've configured the default paths, Windows program files x86, to allow applications that are in those directories to run, right? So that's why I can launch Notepad. So I'm going to launch Notepad, right? Comes up, no issue at all. There's an application I've installed on here, and I've directed it to install at the root of the C drive, and that's rich copy. So if I look at the root of the C drive, I have rich copy installed. If I launch this one, it's not going to run. It's going to be blocked by application control because it is in an untrusted path, right? So again, really simple demo, but still to kind of give you a sense of how things work. And as I think I've mentioned, we have these controls through Config Manager. We can build our policy, but these are not the only controls that you can leverage with application control. If you want other controls, then they're at your fingertips. You can't set them with Configuration Manager, but you can definitely set them with other tools and be able to use Config Manager then to deploy them back to the device or do whatever, right? So actually, let's turn the page for just a second and move on to starting to close the session out. So when we talk about troubleshooting tips and tricks, I want to show you and talk about a couple of things. So let me grab the Windows 10 machine for a minute. I want to give you a couple of things about troubleshooting. Come on. And so the first thing is, we saw in the previous session, Application Guard. In Application Guard, you could follow it by looking at the events in the event viewer. Well, this is no different. Application control will log events into the event viewer. And so if we open up applications and services and then go down to Microsoft and then go down to Windows, and then what are we searching for? Are we searching for application control? No, we're going to search for code integrity, right? Code, go up a little, come on. Code integrity, code, right there, right in front of me. Okay, and then if we open up the events and look at the operations and look for event 3077, you can see detail about the fact that rich copy would not open on my device. So that's just tying that together. So that's why you might want to keep the event log so you can track events such as this and see when that's happening and if it's happening like you think it should and according to the way you want it to with the policy you've configured, right? So in the application guard sense, I showed you there's also a service that runs on the device, and if it's not there, then application guard doesn't work. Is that the case for application control? And the answer is no. This is not implemented as a service. This is implemented at the kernel level, well before the operating system fully loads, right? So no Windows service to look for in this case. Now, on the config manager side, we do have some, well, I say some, a log that's very useful for tracking what's going on with device guard, right? And here it is, device. I said device guard. So device guard is the name that this was previously under, kind of the umbrella this was previously under. That's why the log's still called device guard handler. And if we open this up, we can see the processing of policy and different things. So launching merge apply policy, the different rule options. Here's where policy is stored. You see some of the XML that's going on, right? And ultimately, you can see that this was applied correctly. All rules are compliant. Requesting enforced, policy is compliant. And this one's interesting, app locker policy. So app locker and device or application control, similar kinds of concepts, right? App locker was introduced in the Windows 7 timeframe and really is a Windows 7 kind of approach. If you're on Windows 10 or better, then you're going to want to be on application control. That's kind of the next iteration of application control, if you will. And then basically device guard policy is already compliant, so no issue there. I told you that it would already come down. And all rules are compliant, so we're good. Managed installer is compliant, so we're good. Now, I also captured a historical log here just to show you that there's some good information here. So in the application guard session, I took you from the point of deployment back to the point of being able to discover what the particular configuration item was that described the deployment, maybe for troubleshooting or so on. That's applicable here as well, but it's a little bit easier to do that here because just in the logs, we will show you the ID. So if I search for scope here, yeah, straight down here, handling setting, and then here's the full path of the setting, right? So this is the configuration item unique ID. And so all I would need to do is lift this out of here, and then I can query directly. So let me pull in the site server for a second. I'll show it to you. So I did that. So if I open up SQL, which is already open, I've got a query here that will select from the CI configuration items table where the CI unique ID is that path that was in the log. And that very easily will hone me in on the specific configuration item. I can then look at the SDM package digest, which I've already done, and then review the configuration. So pull that out, open up Notepad. Again, that makes that a little bit easier maybe to read, depending on which you want to use, but there it is, right? There's the policy. I can go through it. I can see it, whatever. So I just thought I would show you that is already shortcutted for you by giving you the actual detail in the log, right? So that's there. Okay, so starting to make sure there's nothing else I wanted to do on the Windows 10 device. Let's see. Nope. So starting to wind down on this, right? So that's config manager. Config manager, not conceptually difficult. Very useful, right? And so on. But I mentioned that there is another way to go through and configure. I knew there was something else I wanted to do on the Windows 10 side. I'll show it to you in a minute. That there is a way to go through and configure these policies outside of config manager, and it's still pretty easy, right? And so there's actually a tool called Windows Defender Application Control Wizard. And this is a tool that's available on GitHub, fully supported by the product team. Let me pull my Windows 10 device back up. So I've got my browser focused on the WDAC Policy Wizard page. I can't do anything with it from here. The reason why I can't do anything with it from here is because I have WDAC policy applied. So I'll show it to you in a minute running on my other PC where you can at least see what it looks like, right? We're not going to go into much detail, any detail really about it. I just want you to know that it's there. But let's look real quick on the config manager side. So if I go into CCM, there's a folder called Device Guard. In Device Guard, you're going to see the binary representation of the policy that Configuration Manager put down on the device, and you'll also see XML representations of that policy. The reason I show you this is, again, If you decide that you need to have additional capabilities beyond what Config Manager gives you, but you still want to use Configuration Manager as kind of a starting place to have the Config Manager managed installer already in place, and so on, then you can use Config Manager to build this policy, which is not the simplest thing in the world, right? As you look at it, it's running slow here for some reason. I'm not sure why, but you get the idea, right? And then take that policy out of Configuration Manager and then use it in another tool such as the Application Control Wizard, that you can tailor it then and redeploy it back out to your systems as needed, right? Now, when you redeploy that, it's not going to be as simple as just replacing the XMLs in the Configuration Manager client directories. No, you'll need to do some other mechanism of deployment. And again, you could have PowerShell, you could have you could actually just place it in the directory on the device where it needs to be in order to be seen when the device boots up, and so on. You could use the application control configuration service provider, a couple of different ways. But as you grow with application control, you very well may outgrow what you want to do, or what you can do in Config Manager. That's not a bad thing, right? It's about protecting your environment and giving you the tools to be able to make your environment secure and have the policies enforced that you need enforced. And so let me show you the Application Guard Wizard. And so or Application Control Wizard, this is it, right? And here's my policy editor, here's my policy creator. I can merge policies together, whatever the case may be. It's a pretty easy UI. You notice this, but I wanted to show you this, right? Multiple policy format, single policy format. Why do I show you that? Because all Config Manager policy will be created in single policy format, right? And this is the format that can be deployed to any Windows 10 device, no problem at all. Or you can choose multiple policies. So this is for 1903 or better of Windows 10. And the beauty of it is you can have, as it says, 32 active policies in place. You could create a baseline policy and then supplement or whatever on top of that as needed. And that's really as far as I'm going to go with this. But this tool, very handy for being able to go create and implement policy on devices when Config Manager is not giving you all of the options you need any longer. And the last thing that I will show you on my Windows 10 device is once you have that policy created, then you can just simply go and put that in place on the device. Again, you could use Config Manager to put it in place on the device, no issue. But in order to stage that policy and have that policy processed when you don't have Config Manager, then you would want to go into the Code Integrity folder and then go into CI policies, Code Integrity policies, and then in the active folder, which is empty in my case because I've not done this external to Config Manager, you could place the policy that is generated by the wizard, and then when the system reboots, it will read that policy and try to apply that policy, right? Okay, so again, still in the wrapping up phase, a couple of things, kind of before you start, just to understand. We've mentioned a couple of these things before. So once a policy is successfully processed on a client PC, then Config Manager will be configured as a managed installer. And to me, that's hugely valuable. If you're in an enterprise and you're trusting Config Manager or Intune or anything else, frankly, any other tool to install on your device, then just having, even if you put a policy out that had nothing in it except the fact, just a blank policy, then Config Manager is going to be implemented as a managed installer. Anything deployed by Config Manager from that point forward, not the stuff Config Manager's already published, right? Which is where you might use path options and so on to cover that. But anything from that point forward that Config Manager installs will be trusted. That's a huge thing to me. Since your enterprise is already being managed by Config Manager, it just makes sense if you want to put something on these devices and have it be trusted, then using Config Manager as that trusted pathway is kind of a default makes sense kind of approach, right? You do have the ability to configure the frequency at which compliance is reassessed on the device. I mentioned this is a configuration item. It is. And so by default, whenever we deploy that, I didn't actually show it to you, but by default, whenever you deploy it, it will be reassessed every 7 days. You can change that to whatever makes sense in your environment. And then this is important. So regardless of the mode of enforcement, whenever you create a policy in Configuration Manager, an application control policy in Configuration Manager, whether you choose audit mode, whether you choose enforcement mode, it does not matter. When you deploy that, then on those PCs that receive it, you will not be able to run anything with the HTA extension, right? So know that. And then I think that's all in that section that I wanted to mention. And then just a few considerations. I mentioned this already as well, that when you configure folders or paths or whatever else, that is as a part of Configuration Manager policy, that is a one-time scan. When that policy arrives on the device, is processed on the device, the contents of those paths or folders or whatever that you specify will be scanned one time, and then anything in there approved automatically. If you then subsequently add to it, then you won't get those things picked up, and they will be blocked, right? I already mentioned the multiple policy thing and other ways that we can deploy this. I didn't mention PowerShell. Did not mention that the application control applets are part of the config CI module, right? And with that, we're done with our discussion of application control. So thanks for hanging out with me, and we will see you next time.